Hey everyone, and welcome back to another of our video contributions for COBB tuning. Today we will be installing the COBB Turbo Inlet Hose on top of our SF intake to complete a full intake from filter to turbocharger. Well, let's get started. The tools needed for COBB's Turbo Inlet Hose are as follows: a 3/8 ratchet, a 10mm socket, a 6-inch extension, a 10mm wrench, both a flathead and a Phillips head screwdriver, a 3mm Allen wrench, or a screwdriver with a 3mm Allen bit, and a pair of lockjaw pliers. Inside of the box, we will find COBB's Turbo Inlet Hose, all needed clamps, and a thank you card with the webpage for installation instructions. Using a 10mm socket, remove the two bolts holding on the intercooler shroud. Then remove the intercooler shroud from the intercooler. Then remove the battery box lid. Using a 10mm socket, remove both nuts holding on the battery tie down to the battery. Then remove it from the vehicle. Using a 10mm wrench, loosen and remove both battery cables and set them aside. Then go ahead and remove the battery from the vehicle. Pinch and remove the wire clips from the front of the battery box. Then remove the battery box front plate. Next, we will remove the ECU plastic top cover. Using a flathead screwdriver, depress the gray tab and pull up on the white handle to remove the ECU connector from the ECU. Next, we will loosen the air filter clamp and remove it from the MAF housing. Using a 3mm Allen wrench or bit, remove the two bolts holding down the MAF sensor to the MAF housing and remove the MAF sensor. Using a 10mm socket, remove the two nuts holding down the mass airflow housing bracket. Then loosen the clamp holding the intake elbow onto the mass airflow housing. Pull the mass airflow housing away from the intake elbow and then up on the studs to remove it from the vehicle. Depress the blue tabs on both sides of the vent tube to remove it from the intake elbow. Then loosen the clamp connecting the intake elbow to the turbo inlet pipe. We can now remove the intake elbow from the turbo inlet pipe. Using a 10mm socket, remove the three bolts holding down the bottom of the battery box. You can now remove the battery box from the vehicle to have better access to the turbo inlet pipe. Using your pliers, pull the clamp away from the recirc hose to remove the recirc hose from the turbo inlet pipe. There is a vacuum line, while very hard to see, running from left to right. The right side of the vacuum hose is running to the top of the turbo inlet pipe. What you will need to do is pull up on the right side of the vacuum hose, removing it from the turbo inlet pipe. Next, we will need to remove the clamp holding the turbo inlet pipe onto the turbocharger itself. Using a 10mm socket with extension and ratchet, we will remove the nut holding on the turbo inlet pipe to the side of the engine. We can now remove the factory turbo inlet pipe from the turbocharger and the side of the engine. Place a clamp onto the new COBB Turbo Inlet Hose and place it onto the turbocharger itself. We will now reconnect the vacuum line to the barbed fitting of the new COBB Turbo Inlet Hose. We can now tighten the clamp securing the turbo inlet hose to the turbocharger. We can now attach the recirculation hose to the bottom opening on the turbo inlet hose. Using your pliers, we will now reattach the clamp to secure the recirculation hose to the turbo inlet hose. We can now attach the intake elbow onto the top of the turbo inlet hose. We will now reinstall the bottom portion of the battery box using the three bolts we removed from earlier, using a 10mm socket. We will now tighten the clamp securing the intake elbow to the turbo inlet hose. Then reattach the vent hose to the vent tube on the intake elbow. Attach the MAF housing into the intake elbow first, then place the bracket on top of the studs. Then tighten the clamp securing the intake elbow to the MAF housing. Then reinstall the nuts, securing the bracket back onto the studs. We will now reinstall the MAF sensor into the MAF housing, using a 3mm Allen wrench or a 3mm Allen bit. We can now reattach the COBB filter to the MAF housing and tighten down the clamp. We can now reattach the ECU connectors to the ECU itself. Gently push down on the white handle, securing them into place. You'll notice it when you hear a click, that it is fully secured. We can now place on the ECU plastic top cover. We can now reinstall the battery box front plate and press the wires that we had originally pressed out back into the front plate. We can now set the battery back into the battery box. You can now reattach the battery cables using your 10mm wrench, securing them to the battery. You will now reattach the battery tie-down, securing it with the two 10mm nuts previously removed. We can now reattach the top of the battery box lid. Then reattach the intercooler shroud and secure it using the two 10mm bolts previously removed. I hope you enjoy the sweet sounds of your turbocharger even more with your new COBB Turbo Inlet Hose installed. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned as we dive deeper each week into what COBB tuning has to offer for your MAZDASPEED3.